1, 2, 3, זה בדיוק, כן. סט.
Shall I start?
Yes.
You asked what was the effect on the Zionists in America of Mr. Ben-Gurion's negotiations with Maurice Wertheim, then president of the American Jewish Committee, and whether it's true that the Zionists took exception to the way these negotiations were conducted. I remember that it was not only Mr. Ben-Gurion who conducted negotiations with Mr. Wertheim. Nachum Goldman and Chaim Greenberg and I met with Mr. Wertheim at his invitation on several occasions. Mr. Wertheim, banker, a broker who became president of the American Jewish Committee and was not known by the American Jewish Committee members or leaders to have ever been friendly or sympathetic to Zionism, actually, at one time, early in his life, was a Zionist. Maurice Wertheim came to Palestine with a Zionist commission. He was a young man then. He was very proud to show me a photograph of himself on a horse when he was in Palestine. I'm sure the date can be gotten. He was one of the associate members of a commission. He was an aide when I think Robert Zold and Lee K. Frankel in America came over. And he still had a nostalgic feeling for the days when he was in Palestine, so that he was predisposed to be friendly. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the negotiations between Wertheim and Ben-Gurion were not initiated by Wertheim rather than by Ben-Gurion, just as I know they were initiated with me and with Chaim Greenberg. He spoke to me first. I was living in Philadelphia, and it was difficult for me to get over to New York as frequently as Mr. Wertheim would want me to. So I introduced him to Chaim Greenberg because I felt Chaim Greenberg would have the strongest effect on him. And it turned out to be so. He admired Chaim Greenberg much more than any other Zionist that he met. And he became a disciple of Chaim Greenberg. He met with him very frequently. That I know from what Chaim Greenberg told me and what Wertheim told me. Unfortunately, Wertheim didn't realize that the American Jewish Committee leadership, and especially the secretariat, the paid officials of the American Jewish Committee, were very much opposed to the Zionist line. So that while he, Wertheim personally, was convinced by what Ben-Gurion told him, by what Weizmann told him, because he met with Weizmann too, no doubt about it, Nachum Goldman, Chaim Greenberg, and I, he could not influence the majority of the members of the American Jewish Committee. And it is interesting that in 1942, when Judge Proskauer ran for the presidency of the American Jewish Committee to succeed Mr. Wertheim. Wertheim's pro-Zionist attitude was overwhelmingly repudiated. Mr. Judge Proskauer said he would take the presidency only if the American Jewish Committee would adopt a resolution which he had prepared. That resolution is to be found in the American Jewish Yearbook, volume 45, which gives Mr. Judge Proskauer's address in full. I appeared at that meeting of the American Jewish Committee not as a Zionist or the president of the Zionist organization, but as a member at large of the American Jewish Committee. I opposed the resolution. The resolution said that the American Jewish Committee would work for a solution of the Palestine problem on the basis of an international trusteeship. That was the only possible solution that the American government would support. And as Americans, we must follow the American State Department's line that Mr. Proskauer said that he had spoken to important people in Washington, and that they said that an international trusteeship was the only feasible solution. We Zionists, of course, oppose that. I was terribly disappointed because I had hoped that a few of the Zionists who were members of the American Jewish Committee and who were at that meeting would support my position. Unfortunately, the president of Hadassah, Mrs. de Solapool, at that time, who was present, also, I think, a member at large, did not express any views. And I don't know whether she voted for the resolution, but she didn't vote against it. I was the only person who registered my negative vote. It was so noted in this volume 45 of the yearbook, which is very interesting. I might say that after I read in the Mideast Observer Mr. Ben-Gurion's reference to Wertheim and to Proskauer, I went to see Mr. Ben-Gurion in Sde Boker just about 4 or 5 weeks ago with a copy of the yearbook. That's why it's fresh in my mind. And he was surprised to learn that Proskauer had ever been the president of the American Jewish Committee. He didn't know that. And he was very much interested in reading Proskauer's statement on the international trusteeship and his colloquy with me, because if you will read Mr. Judge Proskauer's speech, although I am not quoted in the yearbook, every paragraph says, "Now, Judge Levinthal, I don't expect you as a Zionist to agree with me, but believe me, this is not as a result of opposition to Zionism. This is the only feasible way. Let us compromise. Let us agree on an international trusteeship." He believed that that would be the solution. We wouldn't get a Jewish state, but the Arabs would not be in control either of Jewish immigration, and there would be international trustees to control immigration and to decide how the Jewish national home, which he sort of accepted, although he said the Balfour Declaration is meaningless and we should ignore it, it's irrelevant. The past resolutions of the American Jewish Committee are irrelevant merely because Louis Marshall made mistakes. There's no reason why we should perpetuate that mistake. Let's forget the Jewish Agency. I wanted the resolution to make some reference to the Jewish Agency for Palestine, because that was one of the creatures of Louis Marshall as president of the American Jewish Committee, and he said, no, the agency must be eliminated. There is no agency. That was a fiction. There were no non-Zionists on the Jewish Agency. It was all a Zionist fiction. I think you ought to read what Proskauer said there because it's very revealing. Now, most Zionists did not know about the negotiations with Wertheim until Wertheim decided to call a meeting of Mr. Waldman, secretary, and several others of the inside leadership and direction of the American Jewish Committee, at which time we had Chaim Greenberg and Nachum Goldman and myself jointly with the American Jewish Committee. And then Wertheim tried to present a neutral point of view, and yet to indicate that the American Jewish Committee should go along with the Zionist point of view, Ben-Gurion's point of view, and the Nachum Goldman's, all of us. We wanted the American Jewish Committee to take an active part in making of the Jewish Agency what it was intended to be. That was our real purpose of our negotiations. We didn't expect them to come out for a Biltmore platform originally. But the reaction of Mr. Waldman and the others was so unfavorable, so negative, that from that time on, Mr. Wertheim was terribly disheartened. He took sick, as a matter of fact, shortly thereafter. Now, I don't think anybody resented Mr. Ben-Gurion speaking to Wertheim any more than anybody resented what Nachum Goldman was doing at the same time, or Chaim Greenberg, or I. We all were trying to make converts of as many people as possible, and he was a key personality at that time. But unfortunately, the attitude of the American Jewish Committee had become so inflexible by that time that, much to my dismay, when I spoke at that meeting of the American Jewish Committee, the only one who arose to support my reference to the Jewish Agency was Judge Irving Lehman, the brother of Herbert Lehman, who arose and said that he thought I was right in saying that it was unnecessary to omit any reference to the Jewish Agency, and that the resolution ought to have some reference to it out of respect to the past traditions of the American Jewish Committee. But when it came to a vote, even Judge Lehman didn't vote in opposition to the resolution as prepared. Now, you asked, do I remember any other events bearing on the relations between Mr. Ben-Gurion and the Emergency Council. I have very vivid recollections of many exciting meetings at that time. One very exciting meeting had to do with the Jewish Army Committee, the organization which was set up by the Etzel, this man Peter Bergson, Hillel Cook. Some very few of the members of the Emergency Council were of the opinion at that time that an effort should be made to absorb the people of the Jewish Army Committee rather than to have them as a vociferous, articulate group attacking the Zionist leadership for being indifferent, not doing enough, being inactive. And Ben-Gurion came to one of our meetings and very vehemently denounced the Army Committee for what it was, and there was no question after that address of his that from that time on there was no possibility of any reconciliation with that group in America. The question as to the dispute between Weizmann and Ben-Gurion was, of course, rumored about, but there was no specific knowledge to the Zionists generally. On the surface, Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, when they were both together in the United States, did not show the bitter hostility that prevailed, certainly on the part of Ben-Gurion toward Weizmann. But I have a very vivid recollection of a meeting, highly confidential meeting called by Stephen Wise in his study, which was attended by David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, by Robert Zold, Chaim Greenberg, Nachum Goldman, and myself. I don't think there was any woman present. Stephen Wise introduced the meeting by saying that he called the meeting at the request of Ben-Gurion. That Ben-Gurion wanted to have a face-to-face discussion with Dr. Weizmann in the presence of Zionist leaders in America. At that time, he directly accused Weizmann of not being sufficiently loyal to the Zionist cause, that he was unduly influenced by his British associations, friendship for British personalities, and he demanded that Chaim Weizmann resign from the leadership of the Zionist movement. Weizmann, very calmly, but you could see that he was terribly distressed, replied and said that there wasn't the slightest basis in fact for the accusation against him, that he would not resign, that he would leave it to those who were present to say whether they thought he ought to resign. And then every one of us, Chaim Greenberg, Nachum Goldman, myself, and Stephen Wise, supported Weitzman's position. The only man who half-heartedly supported Ben-Gurion was Robert Zoll, who thought that if there was such a strong feeling on the part of Ben-Gurion, then Chaim Weizmann ought to resign and give Ben-Gurion a free hand to work out his solution. He said that the time had definitely come for the declaration of the goal of the Jewish state. That was Bob Zoll's attitude for a long time. I suppose you did interview him, and he must have told you about his part in getting the Zionist organization and Hadassah to adopt those resolutions before the Biltmore platform. And he had the feeling that Weizmann was not in support of that declaration, which of course was true. We come now to the Biltmore Conference. Dr. Weizmann was forced to support the Biltmore program because Ben-Gurion, Robert Zoll, the leadership of Hadassah, had by that time, by the time he called the Biltmore Conference, had all committed themselves to the declaration of a Jewish Commonwealth. It was too late to do anything else. Ben-Gurion had his way. He prepared the groundwork, there's no doubt about it. He did it with Hadassah, he did it with the ZOA, of course he had the labor Zionists, so that all of the parties were in agreement with Ben-Gurion, just for the declaration of the Jewish Commonwealth, not this mass transfer that was never discussed by Ben-Gurion, never. But Weizmann's speech at the Biltmore Conference ought to be studied very carefully. Stephen Wise's address ought to be studied carefully. Stephen Wise came out in support of the Biltmore Conference, the Biltmore Resolution. Stephen Wise was in the chair the night that I, as chairman of the Resolution Committee, presented the Biltmore program, and it was unanimously adopted. Stephen Wise spoke in support of it half-heartedly, because he thought it was a dangerous step. Weizmann supported it. I have a feeling that those addresses must be in the American Zionist.
Well, I've read them.
Were they there? Did Stephen Wise indicate any reluctance to go along, or by the time he made that speech it was wholehearted, wasn't it? Yeah, of course he was a wonderful orator, and once he went in support of a position, there was no indication of his earlier hesitancy. And I know that Weizmann did make the speech that he did. Mayor Grossman was present at the Biltmore program, not as a delegate because he wasn't American. He was up in the gallery. And after Weizmann spoke, or in the middle of the speech, he interrupted and yelled out, "Why this belated repentance? Why this belated conversion?" to Weizmann. Weizmann tried to ignore the interruption. He repeated it. And I think it was Nachum Goldman, or maybe it was Stephen Wise, who at that time said, in statesmanship, everything depends on timing. What was definitely wrong when Jabotinsky was alive and advocating a declaration of a Jewish state could be altogether right in 1942. I don't know whether you remember that it was on that occasion when Stephen Wise presented to Chaim Weizmann the ring which Stephen Wise obtained from Theodor Herzl. That was a very dramatic moment. If you read that speech, you'll see that Wise said that at the Zionist Congress, I think it was the second Zionist Congress, when he said goodbye to Herzl, Herzl told him, "You're a young man, much younger than I probably will not be alive to see the establishment of the Jewish state, but you will be. And I'd like to give you this ring of mine." And he took from his hand a signet ring and gave it to Stephen Wise. Wise then said, in a very dramatic way, "I hope that I shall be alive to see the birth of this day. But I'm sure that you, Chaim Weizmann, will be. You're younger than I. Not much difference, but a few years. I want the honor and privilege of putting on your hand the ring which Herzl gave to me." That happened that night. That was a very dramatic incident that I don't know, I haven't seen referred to. That happened that night. Now the resolutions were worked on at by the committee. There was a subcommittee. I think Bob Zold was the chairman of the subcommittee. Bob Zold had a great deal to do with it. I was on that committee. Chaim Greenberg was on it. I think all of the parties, every organization, had one representative. In addition to myself, I was ex officio because I was the chairman of the Biltmore Company. I opened the chairman as president of the Zionist organization, the oldest organization, which called it. And there certainly was committee discussion on them. I remember one man who appeared before the committee, that was A.K. Epstein. I don't know if the name means anything to you. He was a general Zionist, but very friendly to the labor Zionist point of view. He made a very effective argument why it was absolutely essential that you declare for sovereignty in the Jewish Commonwealth. That any talk of large-scale Jewish immigration without absolute Jewish sovereignty was meaningless. That only a Jewish state could assure immigration. So if you want immigration, the only way it could be done, and he made it so persuasive an argument that I think everybody was won over on that ground alone. I would like to say this: after the Biltmore Conference and before Ben Gurion left, Weizmann took sick. He was up at Grossinger's.
Where?
Grossinger's. That's a mountain resort in New York, Catskill Mountains. He was recuperating from a rather serious illness. I received a telephone call asking whether I could come up to see him. Of course I went. But he was then out of bed, but looked very weak. And in the course of the conversation, he said, the resolution we adopted may mean war, may mean revolution against the British, because he believed at that time that the British would oppose with force the establishment of a Jewish Commonwealth. He said, maybe Ben-Gurion is right. Maybe this is the time for a bar kochba. Ben-Gurion, let him be the bar kochba. I cannot play the role of bar kochba. Ben-Gurion ought to remember what happened to bar kochba. That is an unforgettable conversation. Because I've always felt that Weizmann at heart was above all a pacifist in his international relations. He had a naive, almost a naive faith in the triumph of truth and justice without resorting to force. And that can be seen in his attitude towards even the Haganah here in Israel. At the Zionist Congress in 46, when Kleinbaum, Moshe Sneh, who was at the head, was accused by Weizmann of having lied to him. This was, of course, confidential meeting of the steering committee. And he said that you put me, he said to Kleinbaum, in a terrible position. I asked you whether the Haganah was ever going to resort to violence, follow the line of the Stern Gang and the Etzel. And you promised me that there never would be any resort to violence. And I, on the strength of what you told me, assured my friends in Britain that there would never be any such tactics from our people. And yet you now admit that you did attack, I think it was the King David.
No, it was that there was an agreement between the Haganah and the Etzel.
That they would not interfere with them, or that they would do it. I don't know. Apparently they connived. They connived with it.
The Haganah agreed to the action.
Yeah, they connived with it and didn't tell Weizmann. Kleinbaum as much as said that we felt we couldn't trust you to let you know of our agreement. If we had told you, we were afraid that the British would be told. That happened at the steering committee. That was the big break at that time because Ben-Gurion supported Sneh. Ben-Gurion, I think, did know of that agreement. The only man who didn't know was the head of the organization, who, in reliance upon promises that had been made to him, relayed those promises to the British government. Did I see any divergence between the original Biltmore resolution and Mr. Ben-Gurion's interpretation of it, mass transfer to Palestine? I don't think that Ben-Gurion relied on the Biltmore resolution for his policy of mass transfer. Because the Biltmore resolution is very clear. It doesn't say anything at all about mass transfer. It speaks of control of Jewish immigration by a Jewish Commonwealth. What the Jewish Commonwealth would later do would be a question for the Jewish Commonwealth to determine. But I don't see any divergence, any conflict between the Biltmore resolution as drafted and mass immigration. Or what do you mean by mass transfer?
I'll explain.
You mean mass immigration?
Well, there was a meeting just before Ben Gurion left America.
Yeah.
I think it was the night before, 2 nights before, at which apparently he suggested that the only way to implement the resolution would be to have a very large number. He mentioned 2 million of Jews transferred immediately at the end of hostilities to Palestine, preferably on American ships and with American help. And he thought it would be the task of American Zionists to prepare this mass transfer.
But of course the Zionists repudiated that, didn't they?
That's right, they didn't accept that.
Of course not.
Were you at that meeting?
Yes, we all considered. I don't think he proposed that seriously. Couldn't be, because he certainly must have known that America would not do that. America wouldn't.
But he did suggest it, did he?
Yeah, I think he did, but he said it would be wonderful if this could be done. But I don't think he actually thought for 1 minute that it was a realistic, practical proposal any more, I suppose, than any Zionist who referred to Nordau's similar proposal years gone by. It was actually speaking in realistic terms. At any time, nobody would really want to dump 2 million Jews, if they could, into Israel and let them perish, because that was Nordau's idea. If out of the 2 million, 500,000 survived, all right, we'd have 500,000 live Jews, even if 1.5 million died in the process. I don't think any sane Zionist would believe in that sort of a solution. I think that what everybody felt was that Weizmann's notion of very gradual immigration, one immigrant after an immigrant, remember, cow after cow and all that was too slow a pace. But I don't think any American Zionist, even Bob Zold, who was the most extreme of the regular Zionists, outside of the revisionist group, would have favored such a solution. And certainly I don't remember Ben Gurion saying that the only way the Biltmore platform could be implemented would be by a mass invasion. No, I really don't remember that meeting. If I'm not mistaken, that meeting was not a meeting of the Zionist Council.
No, it was a private meeting called by the Yehuda.
He did that very frequently. That meeting that I discussed first about the Army Committee was not an official meeting of the Zionist Council either. It was a meeting called of leaders who would listen to Ben Gurion, in which he pointed out why it would be disastrous to have any relationship whatsoever with Hillel Cook or any of his supporters, and he prevailed. Any other questions?
Yes, well, I'd like to put a thesis and see what your comment would be on that. Now, you see, when he came back to Palestine at that time, he presented what was afterwards known as the Jerusalem Program to the Inner Zionist Action Committee. And at those 2 meetings and the Jewish Agency Executive meetings that were previous to that, he developed an idea which I thought was different from the spirit of things as they were discussed in New York, as they had been discussed in New York. The formal resolution was the same. It could be interpreted either way. You could say, as Weizmann said, 2 million Jews in 5 years or 10 years. You could say, as Ben Gurion did say in Palace in Jerusalem at that time, 2 million Jews in 1 or 2 years, and you could still cover it with the same resolution.
Certainly.
But he definitely had in mind, and he said it several times, he said it with great vehemence, and people were convinced by it, that there was the chances of implementing the Bilpin resolution were that the great powers after the war, that is in fact America and to a lesser degree Britain, would come to the conclusion that you couldn't do anything else with the millions of Jewish refugees that would then be in existence, except for transferring a very large number of them in a very short time with a tremendous international loan and by American ships to the Middle East and to Palestine, which would, he hoped, be occupied, partially at least, by American army. And that was the idea that he put forward. We had to convince the American government. There's no point in convincing them to transfer 10,000 Jews a year to Palestine. And they wouldn't fight for that. They would fight with the British for a mass immigration of 2 million Jews in a very, very short time. And then the whole business of partition wouldn't arise, because then we would be a majority in the whole of Palestine, and by a normal democratic procedure we would then become masters of the land. That is what I meant by mass transfer, and I have...
And he thought, apparently, that America would agree to fight the British opposition. Britain said it was opposed. Everybody knew that Britain would be opposed.
Yes, quite.
Now, Britain was opposed even to the recommendation of the Harrison Committee for 100,000.
Yes.
And the United States couldn't put that over, which shows how preposterous, how absurd it would be to expect America to fight for a mass immigration.
Well, my question was really...
I think it was quixotic. And I think
whether,
most American Zionists
felt that. Whether you knew about it.
We knew that he proposed it, but nobody took it seriously. I don't believe anybody in America took it seriously as a serious proposal, because we knew how unrealistic it was. Because there was also the talk, whether it was he or Weitzman, many people said it would be wonderful if there could be an exchange of population. That what we want to try to get England to persuade the Arabs to do, voluntarily, to have the Arabs move out of Israel peacefully to the Arab lands, and the Jews, in the equivalent number of Jews by agreement, should leave the Arab lands and come into Palestine. We looked upon that just as quixotic and unrealistic. These were ideas that were thrown out that might be utopian, messianic ideas. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could convince England to try to induce the Arabs to a peaceful exchange of population that would give us the majority of Jews in Israel? We'd have a democratic commonwealth. There were such ideas, but I don't believe anybody, even when Weitzman, I think it was Weitzman who spoke of this.
Both did.
Yes, but no, did Weitzman really think there was any possibility of anybody persuading the Arabs to let the Jews go out and to be replaced by Arabs? I think it was fantastic. We never took it seriously. Nobody.
Well, that's very interesting.
Unless perhaps the revisionists did. I think.
That's on the.
I think the revisionists. I think if you would speak to a man like he's still alive. Did you get an interview from the leader of the revisionists in America, who's
Netanyahu?
now? No. The man who is now Shechtman.
Joseph Shechtman.
Did you get an interview from Shechtman?
I missed it, but
he comes here very often. He'll be here at the next Zionist Congress. He's a member of the executive. The next meeting of the executive. You want to get Shechtman, because to the extent that Ben-Gurion or even Weizmann talked in terms of mass exchange of population or mass transfer of Jews, they were adopting the revisionist point of view completely. That's what the revisionists constantly argued, that we were too timid and not fighting for this, even if we had to make a revolution and blow up the British government here. Fight for that. But I don't think anybody took it. I know I never took it seriously.
May I ask you a supplementary question on that? There is a very interesting negotiation that went on between Weizmann and Philby about Ibn Saud's proposed support of Zionism in exchange for money, etc. Now, you probably know that Weizmann had a discussion with Churchill on the eve of coming to America. And at that discussion, Churchill told him that what he wanted to do was to make Ibn Saud the boss of the bosses.
That's right.
And that he should talk to Roosevelt. Now, never mind what...
I think he did talk to Roosevelt.
Yeah, but very, very much later. Now, you see...
Yeah, he couldn't get to him before.
Now, that's what I wanted to ask. I know that he didn't talk to Roosevelt for the whole of 1942.
He couldn't get an appointment.
Is that so?
As simple as that. And he finally got the appointment through the help of Jacobson, a non-Zionist, the former partner of Truman. And it was through Jacobson and Truman that he got to him. That was the rumor that I heard. I don't know whether it's true or not.
But anyway, the fact that he didn't get to Roosevelt, you explain simply by that Roosevelt didn't want to see him.
He couldn't see him. He was busy with more important things so far as Roosevelt was concerned, American survival, American security. And he was a very busy man. I remember Weizmann telling us that when he finally got the engagement to meet with Roosevelt, he was told that he should prepare a memorandum of what he would like to discuss. But there mightn't be time enough to discuss all that he would like to say, so he would have to leave the memorandum behind after he got through with his conversation. And that he should summarize the memorandum on one half of a page, because Roosevelt was so busy at the time that he might not have time to read more than a half a page on this question. And that's exactly what Weizmann did. Weizmann prepared an elaborate memorandum and then a summary in which he stated succinctly in 2 or 3 sentences the gist, the conclusion of what he wanted to impress upon Truman.
Now, there's another supplementary, question 4, the preparation of the Biltmore Conference. Is it true that a series of resolutions were presented to the committee at the conference that had been written before the conference by Weisgall and a number of his associates, and that these were the groundwork on which the resolution afterwards rested?
I know that Weisgall submitted a memorandum to our committee, to the emergency committee, and it would be interesting to compare the draft of Weisgall's resolution with the final resolution.
It's almost identical.
There were some changes.
There were some changes, yes, but it's almost the same.
The changes were not material?
Not really. The Jewish Commonwealth idea was in it, definitely.
Did he mention Jewish Commonwealth in that resolution? It's very interesting. I'm glad to hear that. Because my impression was that the equivalent of Jewish Commonwealth was there. Control of Jewish immigration and all that. but that the actual use of the words Jewish Commonwealth did not appear in the Weizsäcker resolution, and we thought that was because of Weizmann's attitude. That Weizmann at that time, before the conference, was still of the opinion that it would be misguided, that it was premature. Weizmann thought so. But he changed his mind, at least publicly, although I'm telling you that after the conference was over, when he was sick, when he was talking from his heart, he spoke of the danger of a Bar Kochba resolution, and that he was not destined to be a Bar Kochba. He didn't want the role, and if Ben Gurion wanted it, let Ben Gurion be the Bar Kochba, let him have luck. He put it just as bluntly as that to me after the Biltmore resolution. So certainly his heart was not in that. Therefore, I can't believe, frankly, that Weizsäcker, with the knowledge of Weizmann, because Weizsäcker would certainly not have done anything without the approval of Weizmann, that he would have initiated the suggestion that the term Jewish Commonwealth should be used in the Biltmore resolution. It's possible that by the time he prepared the final draft of the memorandum, he realized that that resolution would have to contain the words Jewish Commonwealth because of the groundwork laid by Ben Gurion before then. In other words, what we did at the Zionist Convention, the ZOA Convention, and the Hadassah Convention, both of which were held contemporaneously in New York, one in the Hotel New Yorker, the other in the Pennsylvania Hotel, at the same time. We synchronized those two conventions so that the identical resolution would be adopted by both conventions to show unity. That was all done under the instigation, definitely, of Ben Gurion. There's no doubt about it. Ben Gurion worked on the Hadassah people, and through Bob Zold, Ben Gurion worked on the ZOA, so that by the time those two conventions were over, the resolutions were identical. They declared publicly for a Jewish Commonwealth, so that if the Biltmore Conference, which was held subsequently, had not had a reference to the Jewish Commonwealth, there would have been a public repudiation of both what the Zionist Organization of America and the Hadassah had previously resolved on unanimously, which was out of the question. So while it may be true that Weizsäcker had that in the memorandum, even with the approval of Weizmann, I am sure that it was not with Weizmann's wholehearted approval, because even after the Biltmore platform was adopted, Weizmann expressed to me his doubts, fears, and misgivings.
Of course, he did come out for a Jewish Commonwealth in his article in the International Affairs in January '42.
I know he did.
Publicly for a Jewish Commonwealth.
I know he did. I know he did.
And that was before the Biltmore and before Weizsäcker sent him the resolutions for approval. So he would have had to repudiate himself.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I suppose he certainly wanted a Jewish Commonwealth, but what he interpreted as a Jewish Commonwealth might have been the very fact that he used the word Commonwealth rather than state, was that it was to be one of the a part of the British Commonwealth.
Well,
I have no doubt that that's what he secretly.
No, he said it openly.
Did he say it here?
Oh yes. No,
he never said it.
Ben Gurion said it as well. Ben Gurion said that yes, within the framework of the British Empire.
Well, they didn't say that at the Biltmore Conference.
No, they wouldn't. Naturally. Well, I think that's about all at the moment, unless you have any other information that I don't know.
I'm just trying to think
like
if there was anything that might be of
child at Manistana that doesn't know what to ask.
Yeah, it might be of some interest, but I honestly don't think so. I think that as to the American Jewish Conference, which followed, of course, the Biltmore Conference, the attitude of the American Jewish Committee there, I remember in voting against the resolution of the American Jewish Conference. You remember the four votes. That is the carryover from what I discussed originally with you as to Proskauer's influence on the American Jewish Committee, that even as late as the American Jewish Conference, where the American Jewish Committee joined with the B'nai B'rith and all the other important organizations in convening the American Jewish Conference, a man as loyal a Zionist as Stephen Wise was reluctant to press for the adoption by the American Jewish Conference of a declaration for a Jewish Commonwealth. You remember that was the great dispute between Silver and Wise that evening. You remember that, of course. So that even as late as that, Leman HaSholom, Wise felt it would be better to have a unanimous resolution coming out from the American Jewish Conference without anybody withdrawing from the American Jewish Conference, which would be slightly weaker, some sort of a compromise in terminology, rather than to have a resolution adopted by an overwhelming majority if anybody any group like the American Jewish Committee or the Jewish Labor Committee would be inclined to withdraw publicly. That the opposition of these two groups might be more harmful from the point of view of the Zionist position in the State Department than a unanimous resolution of all of these organizations for a weaker one. That was Stephen Wise's justification for his position. He didn't ever say that he wasn't in favor as a Zionist of the Jewish Commonwealth, but he was afraid that imposing the Zionist point of view on these non-Zionists at that time might weaken our position vis-a-vis the State Department.
This may seem to be completely beside the point, but I don't think it is. Maurice Wertheim, was he of the German Jewish group?
He was.
He was.
He was. He was of the famous Wertheim banking family. Wertheims of Germany. And enormously wealthy man. But as a young man, I don't believe he was older than 19, 20, or 21, he was in Palestine.
Yeah.
And he came under the influence of that group of Zionists and non-Zionists. Now, what year that was, you could find out.
Oh, I'll find it out.
I'd like you to check.
Yes.
One of the early commissions was as early as 1914, 1916.
No, before that.
Before that, in 1911 maybe. I don't know when it was. I really don't know. I remember his taking from an album a photograph, a very old photograph, when he showed it to us, of himself on a horse, and he pointed out the people who were with him. This was on a tour of Palestine.
Yeah.
He came back, he said, convinced that Palestine had great potentialities. But he never identified himself publicly with the Zionist movement. He was too busy making money, I suppose.
There is, of course, this whole problem, which I would like to ask you, but not now because it's getting late. about 1946, the Zionist Congress. I'll stop it now.